The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Willowcreek, Colorado, as Hannah Oliver sprinted across the wooden boardwalk, her heart pounding against her ribs like a frightened bird. It wasn't her blood that stained her apron crimson, but that of the young man who'd been caught cheating at cards in her father's saloon, a man who now lay in the doctor's office fighting for his life while his attacker cooled his heels in Sheriff Wilson's jail. The year was 1875, and Hannah had seen her share of violence in the 5 years since her family had settled in this mining town, nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. At 23, she had grown accustomed to the rough edges of frontier life, but never to the senseless bloodshed that seemed to follow the gold and silver that drew men west. "Miss Oliver," called a deep voice from behind her. "Miss Oliver, wait." Hannah slowed, reluctantly turning to see the tall figure of Kyle Daniels, his Stetson pulled low over his eyes against the harsh afternoon sun. The cowboy had been working at the Triple D Ranch outside of town for nearly 3 months, and in that time, he'd made a habit of stopping by the saloon whenever he rode into Willowcreek. Not for the whiskey or the card games that drew other men, but as Hannah had come to suspect, for the chance to exchange a few words with her. "Mr. Daniels," she acknowledged, trying to catch her breath. "I'm afraid I'm in rather a hurry. I can see that." His eyes, the color of a summer sky, drifted to the blood on her apron. "Anyone hurt bad?" Johnny Matthews shot over a game of 5-card draw. Hannah shook her head. "I'm fetching more bandages for Doc Wilson." Kyle nodded gravely. "Let me walk with you then." They fell into step together, Kyle shortening his long stride to match hers. At 6'2", he towered over Hannah's petite frame, but there was nothing intimidating about his presence. If anything, she felt safer with him beside her, though she'd never admit as much. "Your pa mentioned you've been working dawn till dusk at the saloon," Kyle said conversationally. "Said he's worried about you pushing yourself too hard." Hannah bristled. "Pa worries too much. I'm perfectly fine." It wasn't entirely true. For weeks now, Hannah had been battling a persistent cough and fatigue that seemed to settle deeper in her bones with each passing day. But with her mother 2 years in the grave and her father struggling to keep the saloon profitable, Hannah couldn't afford the luxury of illness. "Never said you weren't." Kyle's voice was as gentle as his eyes, just passing along the message. They reached the general store, and Hannah hurried inside, grateful for the cool shade after the punishing heat outside. Mrs. Foster, the shopkeeper's wife, clucked sympathetically at the sight of Hannah's blood-stained apron and quickly bundled up the requested bandages and medicines. "Put it on our account," Hannah said, gathering the supplies. "Pa will settle up at the end of the month." Outside, Kyle was waiting, holding the reins of his chestnut mare. "Let me ride you back," he offered. "You're looking a mite pale." Hannah opened her mouth to refuse, but a sudden wave of dizziness washed over her. She swayed slightly, and Kyle's hand shot out to steady her elbow. "I'm fine," she insisted, even as black spots danced at the edges of her vision. "Just the heat." Kyle didn't argue, but his concerned gaze said he didn't believe her. "At least let me carry those for you," he said, nodding at the bundle in her arms. Too exhausted to protest further, Hannah relinquished the supplies and allowed Kyle to walk beside her back to the doctor's office. She was acutely aware of his presence, the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him, the way he walked with one hand hovering near her elbow as if prepared to catch her should she stumble again. When they reached Doc Wilson's small clapboard building, Kyle handed her the bandages but made no move to leave. "Miss Oliver, Hannah," he said, using her given name for the first time. "If you ever need anything, well, I'm not far. The Triple D ticket's just an hour's ride." Hannah met his gaze, momentarily disarmed by the sincerity she found there. "Thank you, Mr. Daniels, but I assure you I can manage just fine on my own." A smile quirked the corner of his mouth. "Never doubted it for a minute, but even the strongest folks need a helping hand now and then." With that, he tipped his hat and turned away, leaving Hannah staring after him with a curious warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat or her creeping illness. The following week saw Hannah's condition deteriorate steadily. The cough that had been a minor irritation bloomed into painful spasms that left her gasping for breath. and the fatigue became so overwhelming that some mornings she could barely drag herself from bed. Still, she persisted in her duties, serving drinks, keeping the books, and maintaining a cheerful facade that fooled everyone but her father. "You're going to see Doc Wilson," Jacob Oliver declared one evening after finding his daughter slumped in a chair in the back room, a handkerchief spotted with blood clutched in her trembling hand. "Pa, it's nothing," Hannah protested weakly. "Just a stubborn cold." Stubborn, yes, like her mother, God rest her soul. Jacob's weathered face creased with worry. "But colds don't last 3 months, daughter, and they don't put blood in your handkerchief." Hannah had no argument for that, but the thought of becoming a burden to her father, of forcing him to hire help he couldn't afford while paying for her medical care, was unbearable. "Give it another week," she pleaded. "If I'm not better by then, I'll go to the doctor. I promise." Jacob reluctantly agreed, but his worried eyes followed Hannah as she moved about the saloon that evening, serving drinks with hands that shook slightly and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was wiping down tables after closing when the doors swung open, admitting a gust of cool night air and the tall figure of Kyle Daniels. Hannah straightened, automatically smoothing her hair before catching herself with a frown. What did it matter what she looked like? Kyle was just another customer, not someone whose opinion should concern her. "We're closed, Mr. Daniels," she called, wincing at the hoarseness of her voice. Kyle approached slowly, removing his hat. His hair, the color of sun-bleached wheat, was tousled from the wind, and his expression was one of quiet concern. "I know, came to speak with your father, actually." Before Hannah could respond, Jacob emerged from the back room. "Kyle," he greeted warmly, "right on time." Hannah glanced between the two men, confusion evident on her face. "What's going on?" Jacob cleared his throat. "I've hired Kyle to help out around here for a spell. The place needs some repairs, and I can't manage them alone." "Since when do cowboys do carpentry?" Hannah asked suspiciously. Kyle smiled, a slow, easy expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Worked as a carpenter's apprentice before I took to ranching. Built half the bunkhouses at the Triple D myself." Hannah's eyes narrowed. This felt like a conspiracy, and she didn't appreciate being kept in the dark. "We can't afford to hire help, Pa, you know that." "We can't afford not to," Jacob countered firmly. "The roof leaks, the back door's hanging by one hinge, and that broken window upstairs is letting in every insect in Colorado territory." Hannah wanted to argue further, but a sudden coughing fit overtook her, forcing her to double over, one hand braced against a table for support. When it finally subsided, she straightened to find both men watching her with identical expressions of concern. "I'm fine," she insisted automatically, though the metallic taste of blood in her mouth belied her words. Kyle took a step toward her, then seemed to think better of it and stopped. "Your pa and I worked out a fair arrangement," he said quietly. "I'll do the repairs in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. The bunkhouse at the Triple D gets mighty crowded this time of year with all the extra hands for the fall roundup." It was a plausible explanation, but Hannah wasn't fooled. She shot her father an accusing look, certain he had orchestrated this whole scenario out of worry for her health. But arguing would only reveal how weak she truly felt, so she forced a tight smile. "Suit yourselves. I'm going to bed." As she climbed the stairs to her small bedroom above the saloon, Hannah could hear the low murmur of the men's voices below. She was too exhausted to eavesdrop, but she had little doubt they were discussing her. The thought should have angered her. She had always prided herself on her independence, but instead, she felt a confusing mixture of frustration and something that felt dangerously like relief. Kyle began work the next morning before dawn, the rhythmic sound of his hammer on the roof waking Hannah from a fitful sleep. She dressed quickly, splashing cold water on her face to hide the pallor of her skin and pinching her cheeks for color before descending to the kitchen. To her surprise, Kyle had already brewed coffee and was sitting at the small table with her father, the two of them deep in conversation over a pile of papers. They fell silent when she entered, confirming her suspicion that she was the subject of their discussion. "Good morning," she said coolly, pouring herself a cup of coffee despite knowing it would likely aggravate her cough. Planning more conspiracies behind my back, her father sighed. Hannah, it's the supply order for the repairs, Kyle interrupted smoothly, pushing the papers toward her. Your pa thought you might want to look it over, being as you keep the books. Hannah hesitated, then took the papers, scanning the neat handwriting with grudging approval. The list was thorough but not extravagant, and the estimated costs were reasonable. This looks fine, she admitted. Good. Kyle stood, draining the last of his coffee. I'll head over to the mercantile then. Should be back before noon. When he had gone, Hannah turned to her father. What's the real reason he's here, Pa? Jacob met his daughter's gaze steadily. The repairs need doing, and Kyle needs a place to stay. That's all there is to it. And it has nothing to do with the fact that I've been coughing. Would it be so terrible if it did? Jacob asked softly. Hannah, you're working yourself into the grave just like your mother did. I can't watch that happen again. Hannah's anger deflated at the pain in her father's voice. I'm not Mama, she said gently, and this is just a stubborn cold. It will pass. But as the day wore on, Hannah found it increasingly difficult to maintain that fiction. The coughing fits came more frequently, leaving her breathless and dizzy. By mid-afternoon, she was so exhausted that she had to sit down between serving customers, something she had never done before, Kyle noticed. Of course he did. His eyes seemed to follow her whenever she was in the room, though he was careful not to hover. He worked steadily, moving from the roof to the broken window upstairs, then to the back door. By evening, the door swung smoothly on new hinges, and the window had been replaced with a neat pane of glass that kept out the insects, but admitted the golden light of sunset. You do good work, Hannah admitted grudgingly as she brought him a plate of stew for dinner. The saloon was quiet, with only a few regulars playing cards in the corner. Kyle looked up from his meal, those startlingly blue eyes meeting hers. Thank you. Your stew's not half bad either. Hannah found herself smiling despite her determination to keep her guard up. There was something about Kyle Daniels that made it hard to maintain her usual defenses, a directness in his gaze, a quiet confidence in his manner that was different from the brash swagger of most cowboys who passed through Willowcreek. My mother's recipe, she said, sliding into the chair across from him. One of the few things she had time to teach me before. She trailed off, unwilling to speak of her mother's illness, which had begun much like her own, a persistent cough that everyone dismissed until it was too late. Kyle seemed to sense her discomfort and changed the subject. Your father tells me you came out here from Philadelphia. Must have been quite a change. Hannah nodded, grateful for the diversion. I was 18 when we left. Pa had lost his job at the factory, and Mama thought the mountain air might help her consumption. A bitter laugh escaped her. Instead, it killed her faster. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Kyle's expression softened, but he didn't offer the usual platitudes about God's will or better places that Hannah had heard too many times. I'm sorry, he said simply. Losing someone you love leaves a hole that nothing else quite fills. You speak as if from experience, Hannah observed. Kyle nodded, his eyes distant. My sister. Typhoid took her when she was 16. I was 20, just back from the war. The war. Hannah hadn't realized he was old enough to have fought in the conflict that had torn the nation apart a decade earlier. Joined up in '64, just in time for the worst of it. Kyle's voice was matter of fact, but Hannah could see the shadows in his eyes. Came west afterward like a lot of men who couldn't settle back into ordinary life. Hannah studied him with new interest. She had assumed Kyle was closer to her own age, perhaps 25 or 26. Now she realized he must be at least 30, though the outdoor life had kept him youthful in appearance. And now you're a cowboy, she said. A smile quirked his lips. Among other things. I've been a soldier, a carpenter, a rancher, might be something else tomorrow. A jack of all trades. Master of none, he finished with a self-deprecating grin, though I do aim to master something one of these days. Hannah was about to reply when another coughing fit seized her, worse than any before. She doubled over, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other clutching the edge of the table as her lungs fought for air. When she finally straightened, she found Kyle kneeling beside her chair, one hand on her back, his face a mask of concern. Hannah, he said, all pretense of casual conversation gone. You need to see the doctor. She shook her head, but the movement sent the room spinning around her. "I'm fine," she insisted, though the words came out as a whisper. "You're not fine." Kyle's voice was gentle but firm. "You're sick and getting sicker. Please let me take you to Doc Wilson." Hannah wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage on her own as she always had. But the room was tilting alarmingly, and the taste of blood was strong in her mouth. She looked up to see her father watching from behind the bar, his face lined with worry. "Tomorrow," she conceded finally. "If I'm not better by tomorrow, I'll go." Kyle looked as if he wanted to argue, but he nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, then." First thing, Hannah didn't make it to tomorrow. In the middle of the night, her father was awakened by the sound of her coughing, followed by a thud. He found her collapsed on the floor of her bedroom, her nightgown stained with blood, her breathing shallow and labored. Kyle, who had been sleeping on a cot in the storeroom, helped Jacob carry Hannah to Doc Wilson's house. The doctor, roused from sleep, took one look at Hannah's pale face and labored breathing and ushered them into his examination room. "How long has she been like this?" he demanded as he pressed a stethoscope to Hannah's chest. "The coughing's been going on for months," Jacob admitted, his voice heavy with guilt, "but it's gotten worse this past week." Doc Wilson's expression was grave as he straightened. "It's pneumonia and a bad case at that. The infection's settled deep in her lungs. Will she?" Jacob couldn't finish the question. "I'll do everything I can," the doctor promised, "but she needs rest, medicine, and constant care, and even then." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Hannah drifted in and out of consciousness as the night wore on. She was vaguely aware of being moved to a bed, of cool compresses on her forehead and bitter medicine being spooned between her lips. Sometimes she thought she heard her mother's voice calling her, and other times she was certain she felt Kyle's strong hand holding hers. When she finally woke fully, sunlight was streaming through the window of an unfamiliar room. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back against the pillows. "Easy," came a familiar voice. "You're not ready to be moving around just yet." Hannah turned her head to find Kyle sitting in a chair beside her bed, his hat in his hands, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Doc Wilson's spare room. You've been here 3 days. 3 days." Hannah struggled to sit up again, panic rising in her chest. "The saloon pa can't manage alone. Your pa's fine," Kyle assured her, gently pressing her back against the pillows. "I've been helping out, and so have some of the other folks in town. Seems a lot of people in Willowcreek are fond of the Olivers." Hannah subsided, too weak to argue. "What's wrong with me?" Kyle's expression sobered. "Pneumonia. Doc says you've probably been fighting it for weeks, maybe months. You should have said something sooner, Hannah." The gentle reproach in his voice made tears sting her eyes. "I couldn't," she whispered. "After Mama died, Pa was so lost. The saloon is all we have. If we lose it, you think your pa cares more about that saloon than he does about you?" Kyle shook his head. "Hannah, he's been beside himself with worry. He's only gone home to change clothes because I promised I wouldn't leave your side until he got back." Hannah turned her face away, unable to bear the intensity of Kyle's gaze. "You shouldn't have to take care of me. It's not your responsibility." "Maybe I want it to be." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Hannah looked back at Kyle, really looked at him for perhaps the first time, the strength in his weathered face, the kindness in his eyes, the patient steadiness of his presence. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you want to burden yourself with someone else's troubles?" Kyle leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Because from the first day I walked into your pa's saloon and saw you standing behind that bar, proud as a queen despite the dust and the noise and the rough men around you, I knew you were someone special, someone worth knowing, someone worth waiting for." Hannah stared at him, speechless. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, with such quiet certainty, such careful honesty. "I don't expect anything from you," Kyle continued when she didn't respond. "Right now, all that matters is getting you well, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this, Hannah. Not unless you want to be." Before Hannah could find her voice to reply, the door opened and her father entered, looking tired but relieved to see her awake. Kyle stood, relinquishing his place beside the bed. "I'll let you two talk," he said, moving toward the door. At the threshold, he paused, looking back at Hannah. Think about what I said. And then he was gone, leaving Hannah with a strange emptiness that had nothing to do with her illness. Recovery was slow and painful. For weeks, Hannah remained in Doc Wilson's spare room, fighting for every breath, battling fevers that left her weak and disoriented. Her father visited daily, as did many of the townspeople, bringing food and well wishes and news of the outside world. But it was Kyle who became her constant, unwavering presence. He divided his time between helping her father at the saloon and sitting with Hannah, reading to her from books borrowed from the schoolteacher, telling her stories of his travels, or simply sitting in companionable silence when she was too tired to talk. Never once did he press her about his declaration by her sicked. It was as if he had meant what he said about expecting nothing, about being willing to wait. And in that patient silence, Hannah found herself drawn to him in ways she had never anticipated. "Why aren't you angry with me?" She asked him one afternoon, as autumn painted the mountains outside her window in shades of gold and crimson. She was sitting up in bed, finally strong enough to feed herself and stay awake for more than an hour at a time. Kyle looked up from the checkerboard they had been playing on. Angry. For what? For hiding how sick I was, for being stubborn, for making you and Pa worry. Kyle considered this, his expression thoughtful. "I reckon I understand why you did it," he said finally. "You were trying to be strong for your Pa just like he tries to be strong for you. That's what family does." "But it was foolish," Hannah insisted. "Doc Wilson says if I'd come to him sooner." "No use dwelling on what might have been," Kyle interrupted gently. "You're getting better now, that's what matters." Hannah studied him, still marveling at his steadiness. "You're not like most men I've known," she said finally. A smile touched his lips. "I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one." Hannah hesitated, then reached across the checkerboard to touch his hand. It was the first time she had initiated contact between them, and she felt a small thrill at the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. "Thank you, Kyle, for everything." His hand turned beneath hers, his fingers wrapping around her smaller ones in a gentle grip. "You don't need to thank me, Hannah. There's nowhere else I'd rather be." The simple honesty of his words touched something deep inside her, a place that had been closed off since her mother's death. For years, Hannah had been the strong one, the caretaker, the person everyone else leaned on. She had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for, to be seen not just for what she could do, but for who she was. As autumn deepened into winter, Hannah slowly regained her strength. By December, she was well enough to return home, though Doc Wilson sternly warned her against resuming her full duties at the saloon. "Your lungs have been damaged," he told her bluntly. "They may never be as strong as they once were. You need to be careful, especially in this cold weather." It was a difficult adjustment for someone who had always prided herself on her independence and resilience. But to Hannah's surprise, she found that accepting help from her father, from the women of the town who took turns bringing meals, and especially from Kyle, didn't diminish her in any way. If anything, it revealed a different kind of strength, the courage to be vulnerable, to admit her limitations, to let others in. Kyle had moved into the room above the saloon while Hannah was at the doctor's, insisting that Jacob needed the help and that the arrangement made sense for everyone. When Hannah returned home, she expected him to move back to the Triple D ranch, but he showed no signs of leaving. "Don't you have a job to get back to?" she asked him one evening as they sat by the fire in the small parlor behind the saloon. Outside, snow was falling, turning Willowcreek into a pristine wonderland of white. Kyle shrugged. "Mr. Davidson understands. Besides, winter's a slow time on the ranch, not much for a cowhand to do except tend to the stock and wait for spring." Hannah wasn't fooled. "You're staying because of me, aren't you?" Kyle met her gaze steadily. "Yes." The simple admission hung between them, neither a demand nor a plea, just a statement of fact. Hannah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire spreading through her chest. "I'm not sure I deserve that kind of devotion," she said softly. "It's not about deserving," Kyle replied. "It's about choosing. And I choose to be here with you for as long as you'll have me." Hannah looked down at her hands, thin and pale against the dark fabric of her dress. "I'm not the same person I was before I got sick," she said finally. "I may never be as strong, as capable, Hannah. Kyle's voice was gentle but firm. I didn't fall in love with you because you could serve drinks or keep books or work from dawn till dusk without complaining. I fell in love with your spirit, your kindness, your fierce determination to take care of the people you love. He reached out, tilting her chin up until she met his gaze. None of that has changed. You love me, Hannah whispered, the words catching in her throat. Kyle smiled, a slow, sure expression that warmed his eyes. I thought that was fairly obvious by now. Say it again, Hannah demanded, her heart pounding. I love you, Hannah Oliver, Kyle said, his voice steady and clear. I have from the first moment I saw you, and I expect I will until my last breath. Hannah stared at him, this man who had waited so patiently, who had seen her at her worst and hadn't turned away. In his eyes, she saw not pity or obligation, but genuine love, a love that asked for nothing but offered everything. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Kyle's smile widened. You could start by telling me if there's any chance you might feel the same way. Hannah thought about the long weeks of her illness, how Kyle's presence had been her anchor in a storm of pain and fear. How his voice reading to her had given her something to hold on to when the darkness seemed overwhelming. How his steady hands had supported her when she took her first faltering steps toward recovery. I think, she said slowly, that I've been falling in love with you for months without even realizing it. The joy that lit Kyle's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his much larger ones. Then may I have your permission to court you properly, Miss Oliver, with your father's blessing, of course. Hannah laughed, the sound clear and free of the rasp that had plagued her for so long. I think we're well past the point of formal courtship, Mr. Daniels. You've already seen me at my worst, after all. Then I look forward to seeing you at your best, Kyle replied, lifting her hand to his lips. And every moment in between. Spring came early to Willowcreek that year, the snow melting from the mountains in a rush that swelled the creek and brought wildflowers blooming across the meadows. With the warmer weather, Hannah's health continued to improve, though she was careful not to overtax herself. Kyle remained a constant presence, dividing his time between helping at the saloon and working at the Triple D Ranch, where Mr. Davidson had promoted him to foreman. On a perfect May morning, with the mountains gleaming in the distance and the air sweet with the scent of new growth, Kyle led Hannah to a small clearing by the creek. He had been mysteriously busy for weeks, disappearing for hours at a time and returning with a satisfied smile that he refused to explain. Now, as they rounded a bend in the path, Hannah gasped. In the clearing stood a small cabin, newly built, with a porch facing the mountains and windows that caught the morning light. Kyle, she breathed, taking in the neat structure with its fresh-cut timber and carefully shingled roof. What is this? Kyle's expression was a mixture of pride and nervousness as he watched her reaction. It's ours, he said simply. If you want it to be. Hannah turned to him, her eyes wide. You built this for us? Kyle nodded, reaching for her hands. I've been saving for years, and your pa helped me buy the land. It's not much, but it's a start. A place of our own, close enough to town that you can still help your pa at the saloon when you're feeling strong enough, but far enough away to give us some peace. Tears welled in Hannah's eyes as she took in the magnitude of what he was offering, not just a home, but a future, built with his own hands as a testament to his love for her. There's only one thing missing, Kyle continued, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small gold band, simple but beautifully crafted. Dropping to one knee before her, he held it up, his eyes never leaving hers. Hannah Oliver, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Hannah looked from the ring to the man kneeling before her, this patient, steadfast man who had waited for her, cared for her, loved her through the darkest days of her life. The answer came as naturally as breathing. Yes, she said, her voice strong and clear. Yes, Kyle Daniels, I will marry you. Kyle slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and gathered her into his arms. As his lips met hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, Hannah knew that she had found something she had never expected, not just love, but a partnership that would weather whatever storms life might bring. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Willowcreek, with Hannah's father beaming proudly and half the town in attendance. As they spoke their vows, Hannah thought of how far they had come, how illness had nearly taken her life, but had given her something precious in return. The knowledge that true strength lies not in independence, but in the courage to let someone else into your heart. In the years that followed, the cabin by the creek became a home filled with laughter and love. Hannah's health remained delicate, but with Kyle's unwavering support, she learned to live fully within her limitations. When their daughter was born a year after their marriage, a blue-eyed, golden-haired child they named Elizabeth, after Kyle's sister Hannah discovered a new kind of joy. And on quiet evenings, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Hannah would often look at Kyle and marvel at the twist of fate that had brought them together, how illness had forced her to accept help, and how in that acceptance she had found the greatest love of her life. "What are you thinking about?" Kyle asked one such evening as they watched their daughter playing in the yard. Now 5 years old and as spirited as her mother had once been, Hannah smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I was thinking about how sometimes the things we fight hardest against turn out to be the very things we need most." Kyle's arm tightened around her. "Like accepting help when you're sick, like accepting love when you're afraid," Hannah corrected gently. "Thank you for waiting for me to be ready." Kyle pressed a kiss to her temple. "I would have waited forever," he said simply. "Some things are worth any amount of patience." As the last light of day faded from the sky, Hannah knew with absolute certainty that he was right. Some things, the most precious things, were indeed worth waiting for. And in the end, it wasn't illness that had defined her life, but the love that had healed her in ways no medicine ever could.